Hello, class. Welcome to my presentation, and my topic today will be polar bears and the quest for a new home. Before we dive into this conversation, I'd like to share you guys a little bit of context just so we're on the same page with global warming. Now, we all know that global warming is a bad influence in our world. We've learned this through our local news or through our biology class that as global warming increases, the sea level rises. So, what this means for polar bears is that on a day to day basis, they rely on ice blocks as major hunting grounds to find for food. Now, when global warming melts those ice blocks, it's going to make it harder for the polar bears to hunt for food, to feed themselves, their children, and their offsprings down the line. As a matter of fact, in the future, it can potentially disrupt their entire food chain. While this is a major issue that should be in our scope, I think there's another topic that we should also bring attention to, and that is what's going on presently. How are they living on a day to day basis with this ongoing situation? And that's something that Christine Lardere and her researchers investigated over the past few decades and published this article as of last year. Now, due to time constrictions, I would just like to share with you guys some of the major findings that they have obtained in this research. Let's start off with this overarching question. How does a polar bear subpopulation adapt in a melting geography? Or, in other words, how are they surviving in these current times? There are two major experiments that I would like to go over. The first one would be about the geography. If you see this image to your left, you can see that there are different clusters of polar bears, which are called subpopulations. The one that researchers are interested are actually the Southeast Greenland subpopulation, or SEG population, as I will call them that for the rest of this video. What they have found is that this population actually lives in a fjord. You can call this as an ice valley, if you will, which basically have mountain terrains covering or looking over this ice sheet, which is basically like a river, so to speak. But if you go down the line to the end of it, you can see these ice sheets eventually break off into ice blocks. As I mentioned in the beginning of this conversation, ice blocks is what polar bears need. So they stay around this area to have their hunting grounds. What's also interesting is that the seg population, on an average of 4 days, only need to travel about 2.5 miles compared to their other subpopulation, where they need to travel up to 25 miles in a 4 day span. That's a 10 times difference, which is amazing to show that a geographical area like this can be a huge game player to determine on how a subpopulation can survive. Now, with this foundation, we want to confirm that this seg population is definitely isolated, that has no influence across any other subpopulations that they encounter. And then this is where the researchers decide to look under the microscope and try to examine these polar bears. So, through genetic tracking, what they did is they essentially gathered RNA samples from their serum and also blood samples, and then combined the analysis together to form this chart. And we can see as a result from these genetic cluster is that most of the seg population are really contained into their own zones. I mean, of course, they do have a little bit of genetic diversity within their northern parts of it, but compared to the rest of the subpopulations where they're evenly spread out, we can clearly see that the seg population over here really stays in their lane. And I find this really interesting to talk about because if we didn't have any, or we didn't apply any microbiology techniques, especially when it comes to blood or RNA sampling, we could have just literally looked through plain observation will say, oh, that's a polar bear. That's a polar bear. And just call it a day. Through genetic tracking, this further solidifies the statement that subpopulations within the Greenland area does exist and they are currently thriving in their own way. It can also show on are they related to each other through genetic history. As I mentioned just a few seconds ago, where it's not literally just one population, you can see a blend of each of their subpopulation or have a little bit of influence to them one another. So that's another thing to appreciate here. The overall conclusion that I came through after reading this article is that if polar bears who can follow the model of the seg population by having a designated safe zone to live at, like a fjord or ice glacier, and there's few competition against the environment, meaning that there's no influence of global warming or other subpopulations that are interfering with their daily lives or other species, then it's basically a sanctuary or a refuge. Now, this is up to as much information that they shared um, so far, but not much any additional solutions because additional research is required to understand on how to further help out these polar bears moving forward. So thank you again to listening to my presentation. Hope you have a good day.